Shutter Speed, Episode 7. Asking somebody if they use Capture One or Lightroom is like asking somebody what do they shoot with. Do they shoot with Nikon, Canon, or Sony? I'm a Canon shooter, but when it comes to Lightroom or Capture One, I use both. And it wasn't until recently I stopped using one and I solely jumped on the bandwagon for one or the other. Today I'm going to talk about 5 reasons why I used Capture One and 5 reasons why I used Lightroom. I had different workflows where I used different applications, whether it was Capture One or Lightroom. So today I'm going to talk about the 5 reasons that I used each, and then also what are the reasons that caused me to jump on one bandwagon and totally ditch the other. That coming up today on Shutter Speed.
Do you love photography? Are you somebody that wants more out of your photography, to make money from your photography but don't know how to start? Welcome to Shutter Speed. Your host, Peter Spakowski, will guide you with tips, strategies, interviews, and know-how to start making money to pay for date night, new gear, or start a full-time career with your passion of photography. Let's get this show started. Here's your host, Peter Spakowski.
Welcome, everybody, and I'm excited to have you here on Shutter Speed. This podcast is just moving along, and I'm seeing a lot of interactions, and I'm liking what I'm seeing as this podcast has been released. At the time of this recording, it's only been released for about a week, so I have several weeks to see what's going to happen. But today I've got an episode talking about Capture One and Lightroom, and what are the benefits of using both. Maybe you're somebody that's on the fence. Maybe you haven't tried Capture One yet. Maybe you haven't tried Lightroom yet. Both of them have released updates to their software, and both of them are amazing updates. Some things that were missing in each of the applications, each of them now have. And some of the reasons why I used one or the other, both of them are kind of starting to get into that similar territory where they're both offering the same things, but one does something better than the other. So that's what's driven my decision on what to use. And I'm going to share that today because my top 5 reasons for using each are slightly different. Why I chose one or over the other recently. I mean, we're talking within a matter of a week or two, I've started using one solely and not even working in the other one. Even importing old catalogs into this new software that I've dedicated as my primary source of image organization and editing. So before we get on to that, I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining me here today. I have a lot of exciting episodes coming up. If you haven't listened to any of the previous episodes, and this is your very first one, I suggest you go and listen to a couple of the different podcasts I had. One being, why every photographer should get an iPhone 12 Pro Max. I absolutely love that phone, and I share the reasons why I think photographers should go out there and use it. And then also, if you're trying to make an income from photography, go and listen to Naming Your Photography Business. That's an important one, as well as the different streams of income. So some really good episodes, some really exciting content, some really important content that you can benefit from. Go and subscribe to this podcast. If it's worth a 5-star review, leave me a 5-star review. If not, send me an email by visiting 2mmacademy.com. Fill out the form on there and what I can do to improve this podcast. I've been doing podcasting for a couple years now, mostly around mindset and life coaching. But my passion is in photography as well as it is in leadership and starting businesses. I've helped dozens of businesses start up and take their revenue sources to higher than people imagine. So I'm wanting to do that. If maybe you're in photography just as a hobby and you want to start making income. It doesn't matter if you want to make an income to pay for dinner on the weekends, buy new gear, or become a full-time professional photographer. Maybe you're already a professional full-time photographer and there's things that you can do in your business to take your business to the next level. That's what this podcast is about. If you have friends that are in the hobby of photography and want to start making an income, share a link, share this podcast with them. I'm sure they'll thank you for it. But today we're talking about Lightroom versus Capture One. When I first started in photography, I never shot in the studio. It was always in a theater. It was maybe on the streets. It wasn't for a few years after I started shooting that Lightroom even became available. I was one of the early adopters of Lightroom, and that was all the way back in 2006. I've always needed something. I was always the person that was uploading pictures through some kind of Explorer and then using Photoshop. I started using Photoshop the very first year it was released too, so that was a long time ago. It wasn't until I started shooting in the studio that I started using Capture One many years later, 10 years in fact. So I used Lightroom for 10 years before I even started using Capture One. And that was because I went to a Peter Hurley seminar and he was using Capture One. And then I got to know Lindsay Adler and she was using Capture One. So I thought, hey, these big names are using Capture One. I better use Capture One. Before that, it was always Scott Kelby. And Scott Kelby had this thing called Photoshop World and the Grid podcast where he was sharing tips. And it was always focused on Lightroom. His online training, Kelby One, has always been focused on Photoshop and Lightroom. He has a couple classes on Capture One now. You can go and do Capture One classes online, which are great. But recently, I stopped using one of them, and I'll share that later in this episode. But let's get started with the 5 reasons why I used Capture One. Number 1, tethering. When you're in a studio, you need to tether to your computer. If you're just taking a picture with your camera, you really miss a lot that later on, maybe when the subject has even left or the person that you were shooting or the item that you were shooting, it's no longer set up and you upload your pictures, you're going to notice things that completely destroy that picture. And you're either going to have to edit it in Photoshop or just ditch the picture altogether. But tethering, when I first started shooting tethering back in 2016, Lightroom was not good at it. It crashed all the time. It was just not consistent. So that was the number 1 reason why I started using Capture One was for tethering. I would take a picture and it's almost instant that it would upload into my computer screen where I had a much bigger image that I could see things that were wrong. I could share the image with the subject and get them excited about the pictures. So really tethering was the main reason why I went and started using Capture One. It was a game changer. It was better than just shooting in your camera and having it upload to your camera. You couldn't share things with your subject. You couldn't see things that were wrong. Maybe the hair was out of place or maybe their eyes were a little funky. But it was something new that also gave you a competitive advantage. People could see instantly how amazing the pictures looked. And if you needed to correct something right away to make it exciting, you could do that. And it just provided such a better experience for the person that you were shooting. So really, Capture One, the number 1 reason why I went to it was for tethering. The second reason why I started using Capture One, when you go into Capture One and you set it up from the initial standpoint, you create a session. And what that session does is it creates a filing system for you on your hard drive. It creates the folders for that session and names it per that session. But then it also organizes your pictures on your hard drive for you. There's a capture folder where it dumps all the pictures that you import, whether through an import process after a shoot. Maybe you're out doing landscape photography or on location photography. You can import and it'll put everything into that capture folder. When you shoot tethered, it automatically dumps all your pictures into that captured folder. Then there's output. So when you update your pictures and you finalize your picture and you make all your edit and you do a save and maybe you export as a JPEG or a TIFF, it will automatically put it into that folder for you. There's also a selects folder where you can go and pick out all the best pictures and you want to protect them and you want to separate them out where you only see those pictures you can upload them to the selects folder. And then there's a trash folder. Anything that you don't like, you can put into that trash. And then later on, you can delete it if you like. So that file organization was so much better. I'm kind of a freak when it comes to organizing pictures on a hard drive. I didn't have a really good process in doing that. And having Capture One automatically create those folders for me was something that made it so much easier to find those pictures. Even years later, when I needed to find a picture of a client that maybe they lost and they wanted to have the most recent update that I had done for them, I can go right to that folder and download it and upload it to ShootProof to share with that client or email them directly. So the hard drive filing system was huge. That was a great addition for something that I was not used to in Lightroom. Lightroom used collections, but it left it up to you to create a file system for Lightroom. Scott Kelby has a great process for creating folders on your hard drive and organizing your pictures. And I followed that, but Capture One took it to another level up, creating folders where it was better organized for me. Number 3 kind of ties into having those different folder systems or the different filing system. And that's Capture One. Every time that you would create a new session with a client, you created a new session. You wouldn't see pictures from past clients. You wouldn't accidentally click a folder where another person's picture popped up. I've had that happen a few times in Lightroom where it's just the person was making a horrible face or it was just an absolute horrible picture of the person. And when you're working with a client, they're like, how did he take that picture? Our clients don't see our horrible pictures. It doesn't matter who you are. Everybody takes horrible pictures, right? We only share those ones that are really good and we want people to see. But if you accidentally clicked on a folder using Lightroom, that person would see that. But I did like having an individual session for each of my clients or each of my different types of shoot that I did. Maybe it was travel and I went on a vacation to Disney World or somewhere like that. I liked having that individual folder. So I thought when I used Capture One, right? The longer I used it, I got to a point where I was only using Capture One for in studio. I still used Lightroom for my travel photography and other items like that. And I'll talk about those reasons later. The 4th reason I liked Capture One, when you imported a picture in Capture One, it tries to estimate what that picture should look like. So it makes slight modifications to the color, the clarity, the sharpness, the exposure. It will automatically do that first initial guess for you. So on first initial import, sometimes the picture looks amazing compared to Lightroom. When Lightroom first does the import, if you don't apply any templates to it, it is what it is. It's, hey, this is what the camera took, and it takes some fine tuning to start to make that picture look better. Similar to what Capture One does automatically, in Lightroom, you kind of needed to do that manually at first to kind of get a better looking image. So for me, having that first initial import of a person, that was very important, because if you import it into Capture One in front of a client the way that Lightroom does, their skin would look gray. It would just look blah. It would look flat. There's a lot that Capture One does to make that first initial image look great. And so I really like that in Capture One. The 5th reason was Capture One back in 2016 was so much faster than Lightroom. I mean, the way that it would import the picture was almost instant. By the time I took the picture, I would look over at the screen and I would maybe most of the time have to wait a fraction of a second. There was a few times that I would have to wait 1 or 2 seconds. With Lightroom, I could find myself waiting 15, 20 seconds before that one image imported into Lightroom, and it just provided a very poor customer experience. Since then, They have fixed things and it's much faster, and the time between the two is not much different. Capture One is still faster. So those are the 5 reasons why I was using Capture One. Those might be good enough reasons for you to start using Capture One if you're a Lightroom user, or those reasons might be enough to keep using Capture One instead of Lightroom. You need to try both. Whichever one works for you is the best one to use. And it took me years to figure out that one of those was better for me. And I'll share those right after I share the reasons why I used Lightroom. All right, so I started using Lightroom back in 2006. It was something new. It was something that replaced Image Raw or Bridge. Those are the only things that we had until Lightroom came around. Lightroom was a showstopper, right? It was a competitive advantage for Adobe, and nobody had seen image organization and image management like Lightroom provided. And so I jumped on board right away. Scott Kelby was coming to a seminar in Detroit. I thought, great, this is an opportunity to go to a Scott Kelby seminar, the guy that knows all about Photoshop, and I've learned so much about Photoshop. So I got to go to Scott Kelby's seminar. He did in-person live seminars, and he was coming to town to do a Lightroom seminar. But there were several reasons why, even many years later, in 2016 to 2021, why I still used Lightroom over Capture One. And a lot of that was for anything that was not done in studio. I still used Lightroom. So I still used Lightroom for those non-studio pictures. There were always a time where I would try to go in and do travel photography and landscape photography in Capture One. And it was great, and I would still use it from time to time, but I was always using Lightroom when it came down to it. If I needed something different, I diverted back to Lightroom. So it became very specific that my Capture One was my application of choice. If I was shooting in the studio, Lightroom was for anything else. But number one reason why I still used Lightroom improved tethering. So even though Capture One was good at tethering, if tethering is your sole reason why you use one application or the other, there's not a whole lot of difference anymore. Lightroom is just as good at tethering as Capture One is. And I loved how fast Adobe had made tethering in Lightroom. So there was still times that maybe I wasn't doing headshots, but I was doing portraits, or even on location, I was still tethering into my computer. So if I was outside, I was tethering into my computer sometimes, depending on where the location was. I would still use tethering because Adobe, within the last 2 versions of Lightroom, have made it so much better. It's still not as fast as Capture One. I've had it hung up on me once in the last 6 months when it was consistent that I was almost having Lightroom lock up every photo shoot. So it's a huge improvement that they've made. Number 2 reason why I used Lightroom. Image management was great. Nobody could handle that better than Capture One. There was one advantage that Lightroom still had. When you go through and you preview your images, what I'll do is I'll pass, or I just won't mark the image, or I will flag it as a non-flag, right? I would flag it as, this image is horrible, I never want to see it again. When you go through each of your images, if you've marked things with an X, you can delete it. You can either delete it from the collection, or you can delete it from your hard drive forever. And for me, I was filling up hard drives like crazy. Even my Dropbox, I would sync everything to Dropbox, and Dropbox would fill up pretty quickly. So having that option to go in and delete those images that were just not good at all and I never wanted to see again. You can do the same thing in Capture One, but it's a little tedious. Lightroom makes it almost transparent. If you're going through each of your pictures and rating them anyways, it's very easy to go in and delete those pictures you don't want. In my workflow, my first initial pass through all the pictures, I either pass or fail it. Pass or fail, pass or fail. It doesn't matter if the image is just so-so. If I still want to keep it, I set it as a pass. If it's something that's horrible, maybe it's blurry, maybe the person was making an ugly face, I'll mark it as an X. When I've gone through the entire collection, I delete everything and then I unflag it. And then I go through and I pass or not pass an image. And any of those things that I pass, I start to move up as a select. So anything that's passed, the second pass through is a select image. And that's where I'm starting to narrow down. What do I want to edit? But using Lightroom, it's been so much easier to save that hard drive space or Dropbox space, right? Dropbox comes at a premium. You need to pay for that. And the more storage that you use, the more expensive it gets. So as I've been able to go through and delete those images that I no longer want, I've been saving a ton of hard drive space, and it's saving me money ultimately by not having to buy new drives for my Drobo or upgrade my space in Dropbox. Because when you get to the unlimited version of Dropbox, which is my next level up that I have to use, it gets quite expensive. So that was a huge game changer for me, and another reason why I was still using Lightroom, even though I was still using Capture One. Number 3 was probably the number one reason, and probably the only reason I continued to use Lightroom when I started to adopt Capture One back in 2016. And that was the amount of integrations that Lightroom provided over Capture One. It provided integrations into Adobe Stock. It provided integrations into Facebook, which is no longer provided. It provided integrations into Blurb, where you can make photo books, photo albums. So because if you listen to the last episode regarding number of work streams, you know that one of my streams of income is I'm a stock photographer. So having the images import into Lightroom, I can very easily select it and have it update into Adobe Stock, where I'm able to sell items and put them up for sale. That alone was such a time saver for me, rather than using Capture One, doing an export into a JPEG file, and then going in and updating into Adobe Stock. Lightroom does it automatically for me. All I do is I drag and drop it into the Adobe Stock integration, and I'm done. That is it. It is that simple, that fast. So for me, the number one reason why I continued using Lightroom, even though I was using Photoshop for 80% of my photos, it was still time saver for me to upload my stock items into Adobe Stock through the integrations that Lightroom provided. So that was huge. Number 4th reason is, much like Capture One has the ability to go and create file structures, Lightroom has collections, and you can create collections. And what it does is it creates like a virtual copy within Lightroom where you can add a photo to collections, and you can go and make all the edits in the world to that image, and it's held within the database of Lightroom. The primary image, the main image, is never touched. It never adds any kind of variant to that image. So if you need to go back to the raw file, it's very simple to do within Lightroom. You can still do it in Capture One. I find it easier to do in Capture One. And I found that I needed to do that more on my travel photography or my stock photography than I ever had to do in Capture One. For example, if I uploaded an image to Adobe Stock and it gets rejected, and they'll give you a reason why it gets rejected, whether it's pixels or noise or low quality, I could easily go back and make those modifications within Lightroom. And that was easy for me to do, just to reset it back, make the adjustments that Adobe wanted me to make before I could put the image up into Adobe stock. So that was a huge reason for me to continue using Lightroom while also using Capture One. The number 5 reason that I used Lightroom over Capture One was keeping color consistency. Keeping color consistency is huge, especially if you're shooting in studio and maybe you have a corporate job where you're shooting multiple headshots. You need to keep that color consistency with the background and the person and keep it consistent across the whole portfolio. If you go on vacation someplace and you're taking pictures of a lighthouse, you need to keep that color consistency, especially if you're going to print some kind of a collage or print those pictures as a collection that you can sell as fine art. You need to have that color consistency so it matches, and being able to do that in Lightroom is so much easier for me. In the workflow of Capture One, you could go and you could see all your images laid out next to each other. You can go and make your base changes, maybe in the color, exposure, brightness, things like that. And you could see that as soon as you imported it into Photoshop to make adjustments, that visibility is gone. You can't do a comparison across multiple images within Capture One once you import into Photoshop. In Lightroom, what you can do is you can transfer that picture to Photoshop, make those changes that you want, close the image out, and it makes a save in Lightroom. So any of those edits that you do in Photoshop, it stays consistent within Lightroom. We're able to see the color consistency across the preview images, across the bottom or the side of the screen, depending on how you have Lightroom set up. I have it across the bottom, and it's very easy for me to see that color consistency even after I've made edits in Photoshop. So that was really big. I enjoyed that. It saves me a lot of time being able to do things like that. Many times when I did that in Capture One and I printed the image, I would get the image back and one would be brighter than the other, and I wanted it to be the same. I wanted the brightness and the coloring to stay consistent because I was putting them both on my wall next to each other. I couldn't do that. The difference was noticeable when I would hang them up next to each other, that the pictures, even though it was the same scene, the coloring was completely off from each other. So that was the 5th reason why I still continued to use Lightroom, especially even in stock, Adobe stock. Maybe there was images that I would upload as stock and the coloring needed to stay consistent because I was part of a collection within Adobe stock. So from 2016 to 2021, maybe around January, February, my Capture One was coming up for renewal. I had to decide if I was going to continue to use Capture One, if I was only going to use Capture One, or what I was going to do. And there were a few things that happened pretty quickly that made it clear to me that I was going to have to choose one or the other. I was going to have to continue because going back and forth between the two, color consistency was not staying. And the reason why, if you haven't guessed already, I've decided to only use Lightroom. I've jumped fully on the Lightroom bandwagon with Adobe. And actually, as of last week, I've canceled my subscription to Capture One. Might come as a shock to some people, but for me, I tried for 5 years to use one or the other. And I tried to make it very specific that I used Capture One during that time for in-studio photography. But the number one reason why I chose to stay with Lightroom, and I've got 3 reasons, and I'll share them on here. But the number one reason was color consistency, and it was regarding headshots. I was having a very hard time going into Capture One, doing updates within Capture One, transporting it to Photoshop, and then putting my final edits on it, and having that color stay consistent, not just for a corporate client or one client where I had multiple pictures, but for my own portfolio. My own portfolio needed to have the same brightness, exposure, color level, warmth, cool, whatever it was across my entire portfolio. Working with Peter Hurley, he was always hammering me on my coloring. And when it came down to it, it was because I was trying to make color edits within Capture One. Capture One does a great job with it, but I had used Lightroom for 15 years. I've used Lightroom for 15 years now, and I'm used to Lightroom. I'm very fast. I'm very consistent. Both of them work great, but for me to keep color consistency across was difficult in Capture One. And the reason why is I would do those color edits in Capture One, very few, white balance, things like that I would make in Capture One, transport it into Photoshop, and the visibility went away. I could not see if the colors were consistent or not. Within Lightroom, what Lightroom does is I can do those edits within Lightroom. I can even do a lot of my Photoshop edits within Lightroom now. Transport the picture over to Photoshop, make my changes, close it, and it saves it to Lightroom. So if I'm looking at my headshots, maybe I can tag everything as my portfolio. And when I click on the tag portfolio, all my portfolio pictures show up at the bottom. I can see the color difference by going through that strip. When in Lightroom or Capture One, the way that I did it, I had an individual session for each of my pictures. So there was no real quick, easy way for me to do it. In Lightroom, everything's under one catalog, sorted by collections, and I can tag each of those collections with portfolio. And when I click on portfolio, all my portfolio pictures show up at the bottom. It doesn't matter what session, a photography session, that I took that picture in. I could get the consistent feel and look across the bottom. Maybe if one was a little bit warmer than the other, I could easily click on that picture, make those modifications to make it cooler. Maybe the exposure was off. I could see that across the film strip on the bottom of the screen. So for me, the number one reason why I'm choosing to only use Lightroom now is that color consistency. Color consistency is number one. The number 2 reason why I'm sticking to Lightroom is that delete feature. Going through and either passing or rejecting a picture, that's the very pass that I make of those pictures. I'm able to save about 40% hard drive space by doing that and doing that easily. I just don't have the time to do that in Capture One that's needed to delete those pictures off my hard drive. Lightroom makes it so easy. I can do each session in about 2 minutes, whether I'm going to delete the picture off my hard drive or not. And that's the very first initial pass that I do on anything I'm shooting, whether it's landscape, on location street photography, or in the studio. I'm able to delete that space and save it very quickly. So it saves me a lot of time, saves me a lot of money, saves me a lot of hard drive space. That's a huge reason, right? For me, it is. Might not be for you. You might be able to have unlimited storage space where you've got, 20, 30 terabyte of data. I have like 15 terabytes of data, but I bet if I did that with all my catalog, I would be down to about 9 terabytes of data. So if sooner or later, I'll start importing those albums that I want to into Lightroom so I have that consistent look. I'm trying to get all of my portfolio sessions from Capture One into Lightroom, make any of those modifications to my portfolio type images so I can have that consistent look in Lightroom that I can compare, but I'm also saving about 40% of hard drive space. So for me, that's huge. Number 3 reason why I'm staying with Lightroom over Capture One is edit history. As I said, as soon as I make my changes in Capture One and then I transfer over into Photoshop to make my final edits, there's no correlation with what changes I made where. If I have to go back later and figure out where I messed up on an edit, it's very hard to do. And I've found that just editing the image again to get the look or fix what I needed to is much easier than going back and removing that modification in Capture One. Lightroom, as soon as I transfer over into Photoshop, make those changes, transfer it back to Lightroom, I can still see all those changes. I can still see all those edits that I made on the image, whether it was done in Lightroom or Photoshop. It's so much easier for me to make those modifications between the two. I would just be lost. I did not have a good way to do that in Capture One. If you have a better way to track those changes that you've made in Capture One or Photoshop that will maybe help me, I'm interested in hearing about it. I love to learn. I'm a photographer that wants to do my own editing. I don't transfer them over to an editor. I want to know how I make those changes to an image and make that image mine, right? Make that look mine. I want to have a consistent look that people can tell that's a Peter Spakowski photo. As soon as I transfer it over to an editor, if I don't have a base image of what makes a picture of Peter Spakowski image, that editor is just going to do the edits that they feel appropriate and put their look on it. That's not what I want. I want my own look for each of my pictures. But that was really, those 3 reasons are really the reason why I'm now sticking with Lightroom. And it's been about 3 weeks now. This podcast is being recorded back in April and it's not being released until June. So by June, it will have been 3 or 4 months that I've stopped using Capture One. And my renewal on Capture One came up on May 15th. And I stopped using it long before that, where I was able to go in, save that $200 a month or $200 a year on just not renewing my Capture One license. So those are the reasons why I like each of them. Both of them are great applications, right? I love both of them, but because I've worked in Lightroom so long and I know how to make the images, or if an image looks green, I know how to fix it very easy in Lightroom. Capture One, I just couldn't tell if it was something I did in Capture One or something I did in Photoshop when I transferred it over. And again, like I said, I needed to go back to the original image and start from scratch. And being able to have all those changes correlated in Lightroom is just, it's a time saver for me. I think initially up front, Capture One saves you time at the very beginning, but in the long term, it really came down to Lightroom was saving me so much more time and allowing me to be more consistent across my portfolio, whether it was headshots, portraits, or stock photography, which is, my primary 3 streams that I specialize in photography. So hopefully this helped you. I'm all for both of them. Like I said, I used both of them for 5 years and I absolutely love both of them. It was just, I could really destroy a picture pretty quickly in Capture One because the adjustments are so fine. Most of them just really need a fine adjustment to a picture. And I found that I was overdoing it. And when you overdo it in Capture One, it really highlights and it really pops out to you. So that's my podcast today on the difference between why I used Lightroom for something and why I used Capture One, and ultimately why I ended up ditching Capture One and I'm sticking solely to Lightroom. Hopefully that helps you. I'm interested in hearing from you. I'm building a community here of photographers, of people who have a passion for photography. Head over to 2mmacademy.com. I'm building a community there for people. If you subscribe to my email list, I'll send you the top 5 ways to start generating revenue by the weekend with your photography. Many people are buying new gear with these strategies that I've put in place and I've shared with them in the past. So it's constantly developing. By the time this podcast is released, there should be a lot of content up there for people. So go and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss a single episode, so you don't miss a single topic that I'm covering on Shutter Speed or at the 2MM Academy. Thank you for joining me here today. I'm excited to have you here. Go out, keep practicing, be consistent, put the amount of work in that you want to generate that revenue from your love of photography.
Thank you for listening today. We would love to hear from you and would love you to engage with the community. For more tools, tips, and know-how, head over to the 2mm Academy at 2mmstudio.com and join us.